person in Chapel Hill. I was able to visit your campus last summer, and I can only imagine how beautiful it is in the spring. So hopefully I'll be able to visit you all again soon and be able to meet you. But today I will be talking to you about linguistic fieldwork in Papua New Guinea. Can you all see my screen? Is that visible? Perfect. So my goal for this presentation is to give you a taste of what it's like to do this kind of research in this area of the world. And what I'm also going to do is to talk you through what I see as some of the major changes that are permeating the field of linguistics right now. First, I'll tell you a bit about Papua New Guinea and what is so fascinating about the linguistic diversity in this region. Then I'll share some of the major findings of my dissertation research, and then I'll conclude with some thoughts about the future. So to help get you oriented, here is a map of Papua New Guinea. It's right to the north of Australia, and I've done all my fieldwork in a tiny village in the southern part of the country, located right at where that pink star is on the map. Papua New Guinea has been an independent country since 1975, but previous colonization in Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, which is to the left of Papua New Guinea, it has marked the region with quite a few confusing names. So this large island here in this pink square is also known as New Guinea. New Guinea is the name that was given to this island, apparently by a Spanish explorer who saw resemblance of the people in New Guinea with those people he had seen along the Guinea coast in Africa. And of course, the Guinea coast in Africa was given its name by colonizers, and that was used to describe both the people and the colonized places. So you had French Guinea, Spanish Guinea, German Guinea, and so on, all along West Africa. And so this New Guinea and the African region of Guinea, they're completely unrelated to the South American country of Guyana, but they're all kind of located around this like equatorial place. Papua of Papua New Guinea is a term that is local to the island in some way. There's a theory that states that Papua, the word, is derived from a language called Tidore, and that's a language that's used by the Sultanate of Tidore, which controlled parts of the island's coastal region. So the interior of Papua New Guinea and Papua is really difficult to access. Which is how this country has remained kind of remote and in isolation up until the present day. There's very high mountain ranges that come up on both sides of the coast. And so much of what was known for a very long time about Papua New Guinea was from the coastal villages, because those were the only accessible places. But apparently in Tidore, the word comes from the words papo, which means to unite, and ua, which is a negation particle. And it means not united, or territory that's geographically very far away. Anyway, so here in the blue, that is so the western half of New Guinea plus the islands to the west. Those make up the independent country of Indonesia. And on the island of New Guinea, there are two provinces of Indonesia, Papua and West Papua. And the eastern half of the island is Papua New Guinea, which is where I did my research. What this map shows you is the location of Papua New Guinea within Oceania. All this landmass to the west here is Indonesia, and to the south here is Australia. Archaeological evidence indicates that people arrived on Papua New Guinea approximately 60,000 years ago. And 60,000 years ago, the global sea level was much lower, so it would have actually been a lot easier to travel from Southeast Asia up here down through Indonesia, across Papua New Guinea, and onto Australia. So that big Torres Strait wasn't always there. Papua New Guinea is diverse in many ways. For a linguist, it is probably the most interesting fact about Papua New Guinea is that there are more than 800 different languages that are spoken in the country. They are spoken by a population of about 8 million people, that are divided into more than 10,000 ethnic clans across 600 islands in the country. So the country has a remarkable diversity of geographic and natural resources as well. It's one of the most rural countries of the world. 82% of its population live in rural areas without access to roads, electricity, hospitals, cell towers, and so on. In this morning's talk, we learned about some of the challenges that there can be with accessing island communities, and the just the high amounts of diversity and linguistic diversity that you can find in island communities and in isolated communities. So you can only imagine that you find similar types of diversity here in Papua New Guinea. I first got involved in the area of Papuan linguistics in 2011. I took a field methods class at a linguistics summer school that was co-taught by Wasang Bio. He's here in the yellow shirt. He's a professor at geology at the University of Garoka, and he spoke the Iti language. And Nicholas Evans here, who's a professor of linguistics at the Australian National University. And he also works in Southern New Guinea. He documents the nearby language of Nen. So this was a field methods course, and if any of you don't know what a linguistic field methods course is like, it's like the movie Arrival with Amy Adams, except of course we're just talking with people who speak a different language, not saving the world from an alien invasion. But like, joking aside, there are field situations in which linguists set out to work in a community in which they don't have any language in common. This is called monolingual fieldwork, when you kind of immerse yourself in a community, no one speaks a common language, and you just have to figure out the language as you go without any help of a common language. The movie Arrival took many methods and tools from this type of monolingual linguistic data collection for the movie Arrival. Any of you have seen it? But luckily for us, Wasang Bio here, who co-taught the class, he spoke very good English, and he spent a good part of his summer teaching us all about the Iti language, which up until 2011, at the year of this class, it had never been formally described by a linguist. So we were the first to be actively formally describing it. You can see these other four people in this photo were all part of that class. To give you a sense of where these languages are spoken, here is a map that my colleague Dinika Sohoken here and we compiled this map based on GPS coordinate data that we collected on our respective field trips to this area. So we went in and we took a GPS locator, and we walked around to different villages and learned what languages were spoken primarily in those villages, and then used the GPS signals to make a map to show where these languages are spoken. So you can see Dinika works on this language Iti, and she mainly worked in this village here called Dimsisi. And I worked on this language called Ende here in this village of Wemol here. So each of these, there's 6 blobs here, and each of these blobs are related to each other, much in the same way that Spanish is related to Portuguese. So they're spoken close by, they sound a lot alike, there's a lot of similarities, but they are likely distinct languages from one another. This family of languages that kind of fits in this little paw print is called Pahaturi River. And it's named after this river down here that kind of snakes up from the Torres Strait up into the area where these languages are spoken. One of these languages, Ende, is the language that I wrote my dissertation on. And you can see that Ende is separated from Iti by this other language called Tame, and the Nen language where what Nick works on is spoken here to the west of Iti. Each of these villages are about maybe 10 kilometers apart. So they're not very big distances, but they're not big distances like as the crow flies, but typically there's a lot of terrain and swampland, grassland, limited roads. And so it is more difficult to navigate than you might think. So in 2015, 3 Ende speakers, Wardama Krupel, who is pictured here in the middle, and his two sons. They walked from Limol to Bumadaban, which took about 3 days. And they asked Nick Evans, again, this guy here, they asked him if he would send a linguist that would come and assist them with the Ende Language Committee's goals to write down and preserve the Ende language. So in 2015, Nick knew that I needed a dissertation topic, so he sent the video to me. I said yes to their request. And so that summer of 2015, I made my first trip to Limol. At the time, I was living in California, and it took me 2 weeks to get to Limol. It involved 6 planes, 2 days on a boat going down the Fly River. So up here, you can see the Fly River coming up here, and going down the Bituri River, which is this river right here. And finally, there was a hike from the Bituri River to get to Limol village. This picture here has Lois Krupel. She was the first Ende speaker that I met in PNG, and she accompanied me on this boat ride. And we're in the boat, and she's teaching me some basic Ende phrases so that when I got to Limol, I'd be able to introduce myself to the villagers there. When I arrived in Limol, I was generously welcomed and cared for by the Ende tribe. I spent a little more than 11 months in Limol village, and it took me 5 different trips to get there to document and describe the language to the extent which I was able to during my dissertation. And the project here, you can see a lot of the faces of the people who helped me. These are the people that initiated and directed the Ende language project. People were very eager to help me understand the language, the culture. They wanted to help me write my dissertation, and they also wanted me to assist the Ende Language Committee in producing books, dictionaries, other materials for the community. So we worked together on a lot of those efforts. So a couple of times I've mentioned this word diversity, and I kind of want to zoom out a little bit and tell you exactly what I mean when I talk about the type of diversity that's available when you're doing fieldwork in Papua New Guinea. There's incredible amounts of linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, biological diversity. This is another map of Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. Each colored shape on this map represents a different language or different group of languages that are related to one another. And it's just someone's idea of how the languages are related. Papua New Guinea holds the title of the most linguistically diverse country in the world, with at least 850 unique languages. And in fact, on all 3 measures of diversity, so number of languages, number of families, and typological diversity, New Guinea is roughly comparable if you took all of Europe and all of Asia and you shrunk it down to 1% of the world's land surface. That's what you have here in New Guinea. So a theme of today's presentation is going to show just how little we actually know about Papua New Guinea. And the fact that this picture right here only represents a very crude estimation of the linguistic diversity of the area. On each of the trips that I've gone into southern New Guinea, I have learned of a new language that is not represented on this map. So even up until 2019, we are still learning about more linguistic systems that are not even represented here. Nisha says this map is written in Basque. I didn't know that, but very cool. So let me go to the next. So if you look at this green area right here, this is the area of southern New Guinea where I work. And it's all bright green. And so you might think that all of these languages are related to each other because they're all colored bright green. But let me zoom in on this area. So in fact, this area represents at least 9 unrelated language families. You have the Mororori, you have South Central Papuan, Nambu, Tonga, Yai, Pahaturi River, Eastern Transfly, Trans-New Guinea, and Australian language family. So when linguists say that these languages are unrelated to each other, what it means is that we haven't yet observed any shared features in the two languages that would indicate that they may have derived from a common ancestor. So you may think, that languages like Russian and English are, very, very, very different from each other, but we are still able to, we have evidence from these two languages that, a very long time ago, these shared a common ancestor, and so they're somewhat related. Here in this area, we don't even have just the faintest evidence that these languages are related to one another. And I'll give you an example of how different the languages are. And I'll show you a bit of three languages that we know something about. We'll look at Nen, which is a Yam family language, Iti, and Ende. Iti and Ende are related to one another, but Nen is part of the next family over. So just one feature that distinguishes these three languages is in the alignment of case marking on nouns and pronouns. So this feature, it's considered to be a very central or core property of language. It's one that's very resistant to language change. So if two languages come into contact with one another and one of them has an alignment of nominative accusative and another language has an alignment of ergative absolutive, they often don't borrow these from each other. And so if you can find these kind of core features, from this, you can stipulate what these languages must have looked like a very long time ago, because we think that these areas are most resistant to change. So let's start with the language that we know, English. English has a neutral accusative alignment pattern with regards to case marking. Neutral with full arguments, and accusative with regards to pronouns. So if we look at a sentence with one argument, like the girl walks, this is an intransitive verb, the girl is not marked, and the pronoun she is what we would call the nominative case in English. And then if we take a transitive sentence using the same arguments, like the girl and she, we can have a sentence like the girl hugs the girl, and that's a different girl there. If we were to place these with pronouns, we could get she hugs her. And so she and her are different from one another, and that she is in the nominative case and her is in the accusative case. So we have this alignment where subjects of intransitive sentences and subjects of transitive sentences are marked the same in English, but objects of transitive sentences are marked differently. And this is accusative alignment. Okay? And let's look at a language of Papua New Guinea. We have Nen. In Nen, you can see that Nen has an ergative alignment. So for arguments like the girl, you have the girl, she walks. And so the girl is kind of marked with this marker that indicates that this is in the absolutive case for an intransitive sentence. For a transitive, if we had something like the girl hugs the girl, the subject of the sentence, the huggee, is marked with her or just a different case alignment. And the girl that's the object of the hugging, the hugger gets marked with a special case, but the huggee is marked with the same case as the subject in the intransitive, all right? So this is ergative absolutive alignment. Subjects of intransitive sentences and objects of transitive sentences are marked identically, whereas the agent of the transitive sentence is marked differently, all right? So you can see English has blue, blue, red. Nen has blue, red, blue. Okay, so this is a very different system. What about another language in this area? Iti has the very same alignment pattern as English. Iti is related to Ende. It's spoken very closely to Nen. The way that it marks arguments like the girl is with this kind of core argument. They're all marked the same. The girl, she walks. The girl, she hugs the girl. All of them are marked neutrally. So none of them are marked differently from one another. But when you have pronouns like she walks or she hugs her, then the pronouns are marked in a nominative accusative alignment. Ende is slightly different in that both the pronouns and the arguments are marked in an accusative fashion. So in this very small area of New Guinea, where these languages are spoken within 40 kilometers from one another, you get three very different systems. And this kind of diversity is quite rare in such a small area. If we look at the alignment of case marking of noun phrases across the world, this map is from WALS, and it has data from 172 languages, and it shows the patterns of case marking on noun phrases. So we see clusters of gray, which is the English and IDI pattern. The blue dots are languages with the Ende pattern, and in Europe you see this yellow dot. That's Basque. Africa and North America. And the red dots here are the NEN pattern. All right, so you've got ergative in red, you've got accusative in blue, and you've got neutral in gray. All right, and you can already see that there are quite a few types of systems documented for New Guinea and Australia, and you just get just a lot of diversity in this area. There's some other really kind of funky linguistic characteristics of the area. For example, Ende has height vowel harmony. And what that means is that if a word has one high vowel like E or U, then other vowels in the word will also be high. IDI has a completely different vowel harmony system. Vowels are either light or dark, and all vowels in the word must agree in color of lightness or darkness. The Bitor language, which is spoken right in between IDI and Ende right here, and the Marind languages, which are over here, they have gender systems like French or Spanish have, but none of the other languages on this map have gender systems. Nan and Nimbo, which are spoken to the left here, they have really interesting labial velar plosives like ba and ba. They are very rare elsewhere in the region and very rare in the world, but Nan and Nimbo have them, and IDI has actually seems to be borrowing them. So I could keep going on, but the fact is that these languages, they're just extremely different from each other. It's a linguistics paradise. Any kind of language that you want to find, you can find it in New Guinea. Here we go. So another way in which this area is diverse is in terms of culture. And in doing linguistic fieldwork, we learn a lot, not only about the language system, but about the cultural system that the language is embedded in. There are many cultural features that are similar across the region, and there's also many differences. One example that I wanted to share with you is that we can compare something really basic culturally, like the way that people count. If we compare counting systems across this area, we're going to find very different ones. Nen, remember here, has a cenary or base 6 counting system. So that means you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you start over again. 6 plus 1, 6 plus 2, 6 plus 3, 6 plus 4, 6 plus 5, and then you have 12. 12 plus 1, 12 plus 2, 12 plus 3, and so on. So it's a base 6 counting system. And when I talk to speakers who share this cenary-based counting system, they always laugh and say that when you only count to 5 on your hand, it's because you're missing this last counting place, which is your wrist. So you count all the way to 5, and then you count here too before you go back around. Ende speakers are familiar with the base 6 counting system, but they actually prefer a 19-term body part counting system, which starts at your pinky and goes all the way up your arm, across your chest, and down the other side. It's not a base 19 system, so you can't count higher than 19 using this, but you can count all the way up to 19. Meanwhile, speakers of Guinea over here allegedly have a base 3 counting system, and that language hasn't been studied very much, so it's a bit tenuous. Base 3 counting systems in the world in general are very rare. So this is what the base 6 system in Nen looks like. The word for 1 is ambas. The word for 2 is sombas. The word for 3 is nambis. The word for 4 is actually the words 2 and 2 together. The word for 5 means side of the hand. And the word for 6 is 1 pus. Then you get to 7 and you get 1 pus plus 1. The word for 12 is 2 pus. So 12 is kind of like 20 in a base 10 system. So one theory for why this language has a cenary counting system, or base 6, is that it has to do with yam counting and the way that yams can be organized in piles of 6. And so this is a classic chicken and the egg problem, because you don't know whether do people count yams in 6s because you have a cenary-based counting system, or do you have a cenary-based counting system because people count yams in 6s. But in this part of the world, yam counting is a ritual display in which you go out to the garden, you collect all of your yams, and before you put the yams in the yam house for the year, you dig up the yams. Before you put them in there, you count them. And I wanted to share a video of how this counting works. And let me make sure that I'm sharing with sound. All right. This is a loud recording, so if it's very loud, I apologize, but be ready with your volume. Okay, so let me just, oops, I'm not sure how to get rid of this. Okay, so you can see that there's a pile of yams that haven't been counted yet. And there are 2 people, each one of them grabs 3 yams and is putting it in a pile here. There's a counter who's yelling out the numbers, and he counts 1 through 6. By the time he says 6, there's going to be 36 yams in that pile, because each number has 6 yams in it. So you can see that when they got to 36, they took out 1 yam and they put it in this pile over here, and that is the counter yam. So as you get to 36, you take out 1, and that kind of shows that you have 36. Then when you get to another 36, you take out 2, so you have 2 times 36. When you get to the end, you get, so 1 6 by 6 is called a feta. When you get 6 by 6s, that's 216. That's a tarumba. And it just keeps going on higher and higher. And people who can collect a tarumba of yams are people that will be able to feed their family for an entire year. So I hope that was fun. This wasn't in one of the villages that I worked in, but a nearby village, and so many of what it looks very similar. So here's a practice. So this is in Limol village, actually, where I am. And yam counting isn't as widely attested over here, but some people, including Donai Krubal, who is sitting right here, she remembers how to do the formal yam counting ceremony. And you can see here that the yams are each piled in 6s around a central counting stick. And each one of the yams, the counter yams are placed in the center. And everything is done in 6s. Here is the final yam pile, what it looks like near the end. and the counter yams are outside the pile to keep track of how many yams are counted. But speakers in Ende don't use the base-6 system when counting things besides yams. They only use it to count yams. In other places, when they're counting, they use this 19-term body part counting system. Here, the subtitles are in Ende, but you can see the body parts that he points to that refers to the numbers 1 through 19. You'll see he starts at the pinky, and by the time you get to 5, you're at the thumb. So if somebody asked you how many children you had, and you had 5 children, you would say, you would answer, like, I have thumb children.
Okay, go.
Trangisa Katolma Mutkin Tupi Manda Gaben Tangkum Mata Nono Jar Apte Nono Apte Mata Apte Tangkum Apte Gaben Apte Manda Apte Tupi Apte Mutkin Apte Katolma Trangisa.
So that's how you get from 1 to 19 in Ende. So some of you might be wondering, how can such a small geographic area host so much cultural diversity and linguistic diversity? A reasonable hypothesis would be, as I kind of alluded to earlier, that the linguistic and cultural communities, they're so isolated from one another because the terrain is so impenetrable that linguistic and cultural evolution proceeded without influence from its neighbors. So you get like little pockets of people, their culture and their language keeps evolving over time. You don't have influence from your neighbors, and so they start to look very different from one another. So this is a reasonable guess, but it would be incorrect in Southern New Guinea. In fact, all of these communities interact with each other regularly, and they have interacted on a daily basis for thousands of years. This is Wagiwa Gesser talking about language and life in Limol. And she gives a long list of very diverse languages. She talks about how all of the languages are equal. No one language is better than another. And this practice where you have, in one household, 6 or 7 different languages being spoken, it's called egalitarian multilingualism. So children, they're raised to speak their father's language at home, but they also learn many regional languages in order to communicate with family members and friends and other people who live in the village. I won't play this clip right now because I think there's a lot more I want to say. But so this kind of rampant multilingualism goes against this hypothesis that the reason we have so much diversity is due to isolation. It's not due to isolation. But I want to tell you a little bit about something really that for my dissertation. So I lived there for 11 months. I was searching for something in the Ende language's structure that really fascinated me in order to have a topic for my dissertation. And one of the most beautiful aspects I thought of Ende language is its verbal morphology. Describing Ende's complex verbal paradigms, it's what kept me busy all day while I was in Limol, and it kept me up most nights as I was trying to figure it out. And in order to help explain it to you how this morphology system works, first I'm going to start with an English example of what verbal morphology is, and we'll take it from there to Ende. So if we take a simple present tense and past tense paradigm of the English verb to walk, we'll notice 3 things. First, you can see that in some varieties of English, the verb walk ends with an S in the present tense. So you have I walk, you walk, he walks, we walk, you all walk, they walk. Similarly, in the past tense, you get this ed suffix. So based on this distribution, what we can conclude is that the morpheme S marks the present tense third person singular subject, and the morpheme ed marks past tense for all subjects. The part of the verb that does not change, which is walk, is the root or the stem of the verb. All right. So in this very basic paradigm, we have one root, one marker for present third person singular subject, and one marker for past tense. All right. So in contrast, if we look at the paradigm for to run in Ende, we already see that it is much more morphologically complex. Like English, past tense ed, Ende has tense markers, that mark remote past. Remote past is anything that happened before yesterday evening. We have markers that mark recent past, so anything that happened since yesterday at sunset. We have markers, these are the prefixes that mark the future tense, so anything happening in the future. Just like we have English third person singular present s, Ende also has markers that have subject and tense at the same time, that flag both of those or index both of those characteristics. So we have the remote and future third person non-dual. You don't have to memorize all of these, but a remote first and second future one dual. We have remote third dual future second and third dual, recent past first and third non-dual, recent second non-dual, recent first and second dual. Okay, so you can see that there's lots and lots of morphology here, but it's very consistent across the paradigms. Another way that Ende and English are different is that English only has one root for to walk, which is walk, but Ende has two roots for many verbs. So in this example, we have run here. Dindu or indug, you see this in red, is used when you have a non-plural subject. So if you have one or two people as your subject, then it's dindu. But it's wijmol if you have plural subjects. So not only do you have lots of prefixes and suffixes for verbal morphology, but you also have two different roots. So if we were to compare just the intransitive verb morphology, you can see that endes is much more complex. And that's just the intransitive verbs. The transitive verbs are much better, in my opinion. So that's just like the basics. That's just describing what the morphology is doing. And honestly, it's complex, but it's kind of boring. I mean, you put it all together, you get a verb conjugation. You all know those like big books of 500 verbs. You know, you could write one of those books. But what really got me, and this is the subject of my dissertation, was something called a ghost. This is a phonological term of a ghost segment. And while I was describing and analyzing these verb paradigms, I detected some very spooky behavior. So to show you this pattern, I will first give you the verb for to dive for fish. So in this sentence here, I've emphasized the root, but it says tutum bogo gongkubogan, and that means yesterday he dived for fish. So this root here, it's preceded by a prefix that marks tense and patient, and a suffix that marks the tense and the agent. Now, this is the inflected form. So we've got prefixes and suffixes that come after. We can compare this form with the infinitival form here. This is a sentence that means I started to dive for fish. Ngana kumbag de dunkam. So the only difference between these two forms is one is that this is an inflected form and this is an infinitival. I started to dive. This is kind of like the to construction in English. But there's another key difference between these roots. The nasals. So there is a nasal sound that precedes the K in the inflected form. We have gong kabogan. And that nasal sound, that velar nasal here, doesn't appear before the K in the infinitival form, but we get an addition of this M sound before the B. So this is what is called a floating segment or a floating nasal. This ang here floats along, and instead of appearing before the K, it appears before the B. It changes its nature because K's are velar stops, B's are labial stops. And so you get a velar nasal here and a labial nasal there. Okay. And so we get this movement of the angma from before the G here, or from before the B here to before the K in the inflected form. The floating nasals, they skip sonorant consonants, so they only occur before obstruents, so in this case, stops or affricates. And so they are freely able to kind of move throughout the word based on whether it's in its inflected form or whether it's in its infinitival form. As I was collecting verb roots, we had lots of, I collected lots of different paradigms, and you can see that there's 48 verbs in Ende that have this floating nasal pattern. Now, if a verb has only one obstruent and it's in initial position, so here for these two, you saw that there were two obstruents, or in this case, three obstruents, and the nasal floats between the first one and the second one. First one here, second one here. The second example, there's two obstruents, and the nasal, first it's in the inflected form, it's before the first one, in the infinitival form, it's before the second one. If you have a root that only has one obstruent, it occurs before that initial obstruent in its inflected form, but it disappears in the infinitival form. In this infinitival form, there's no evidence of a floating nasal. And that's where it gets its ghost properties, because it just disappears or appears as if out of nowhere. There are 33 verb roots in Ende that have a disappearing nasal. If, however, a verb has only one obstruent and that obstruent is in a non-root initial position, then the nasal actually remains in place. So here there's only one obstruent here. It's at the end of the root, and it actually stays in place in both the inflected and in the infinitival forms. And so this happens quite a bit in about 15 verb roots. And so you can see this pattern here. The nasals in question that have little circles around them, what they do is they always precede the first obstruent in the word when in word medial position. So in all these cases, these are all preceded by prefixes, and you just find the first obstruent and the nasal precedes it. In the infinitival form, same thing goes. It's always before the first obstruent, but that obstruent has to be in word medial position. And for any of you who study phonetics or know a bit of phonetics, you know that having a nasal at the beginning of a word followed by a stop is not a great way to start a word. And so that's why I analyze this as this floating property. So it moves to the middle of the word where it can be pronounced and heard more easily. So I analyze these floating segments as a phonological phenomenon known as a ghost segment. Ghosts, they're pieces of phonological material that are somewhat less fixed in one position in the word, and they're able to move more freely around in the word, and they can disappear if they need to. In my dissertation, I wrote about this ghost element pattern, and I wrote about several others. And for my dissertation, I formulated an analysis of these patterns using optimality theory. That's a formal framework for modeling phonological patterns. And I successfully convinced my dissertation committee of the existence of ghosts, at least in this language. But this phonological work, it was a very small slice of what I learned while doing field work in Papua New Guinea. And arguably, I would say it is not the most important lesson I learned, but it was the one that made my advisors the happiest. Some even more important lessons that I learned while in New Guinea is that the linguistic fieldwork as an enterprise and as a methodology is changing. In the history or like the tradition of doing linguistic fieldwork, it's kind of thought of as this very kind of antiquated, very exotified Indiana Jones type adventure story where one like linguist or anthropologist, usually male, goes into an untouched corner of the world, discovers something amazing like this language, brings back that language as an object, puts it in a museum or a dissertation, and that's it. That's done. And the people who spoke that language or had those artifacts, kind of never see them again. And in the last couple decades, we have seen this huge shift from kind of one out of a linguist-led field work to something that is more collaborative. So you see community collaboration. You see a linguist that is often external, but sometimes also internal. So it may be someone who speaks the language or may be a member of the community themselves and has received linguistic training, working together with community members. So here you can see that I have trained this speaker in how to do linguistic interviews. I'm monitoring the recording headset. He is asking his grandfather questions and writing things down. And so we're working together on this project. Um, and this is kind of where we're at right now, where it's a very collaborative experience between the linguists and the community members. But I think that we're even seeing a further shift where the language projects that are being developed now are often community led, where an external linguist provides tools or skills or equipment, and the community members themselves lead the work of the project. So on my last trip to New Guinea, I led an 8-week technology training in which I taught people how to use recorders, how to use computers, basics, how to use solar panels, and so on and so on. And then I sent out about 20 people to document and describe their language. And they did so in very different ways than I would have as a trained linguist. And I think that this, and I know that this actually enriched the documentation of the language. It has enriched scientific value, but of course, there's a lot of personal value there as well. So this shift towards having a more community-led documentation means that there's more emphasis on things that interest native speakers, things like language variation. We know that people are very interested in dialects and why, people who live on Ocracoke Island speak differently than people in North Carolina. So this type of emphasis on language variation is something that fascinates native speakers. It fascinates communities. By focusing on language variation, we can not only just collaborate, but be working on topics that are of interest to the community, much more than my phonological analysis of ghost segments, which is less interesting, at least to this community. There's also more emphasis on multilingualism. The enterprise of linguistic fieldwork requires a linguist to work just on one language at a time. And that is something that is making less and less sense in areas of the world where many languages are spoken all at once. I've also in my research practice, I've seen an increased emphasis on documentation of literary genres, which don't which have have a more peripheral role in linguistics as a science. For example, the increased attention to sociophonetic variation in the Ende corpus has led to collaborative work with Catherine Strong and Katie Drager, pictured below, at the University of Hawaii. We've been able to provide an analysis that shows how some older, prestigious members of the community, called orders, are speaking significantly differently than other members of the community. So I worked with, you see this picture here, with a team of community linguists who helped me gather sociolinguistic interviews of more than 70 people in the village. And those are the interviews that we used to do this sociophonetic variation work. We've also seen an increased, we've also had some great research in the area of multilingualism. Pictured here is Leela Munsif. She's an undergraduate at Boston University. And together we've looked at the state of multilingualism in Limal. Part of that sociolinguistic questionnaire asked people about what languages they speak. And what we found is that the levels of multilingualism seem to be pretty stable across time. So here on the x-axis here, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have the percentage of people that speak different languages. And we see that over time, people in the community are remaining multilingual, but the language profiles are changing. We're seeing a much higher use of multilingualism with local languages and English, and a sharp decline in languages such as Motu and Tokpisin, which were our previous lingua francas. And this green line is a sharp decline in other Pahaturi River languages. So we see that young Ende speakers are not speaking as many other Pahaturi River languages as their generations before them. So this is another aspect of research that has been made possible because of this community-led initiative. After the technology training, many speakers came together to produce a 30-minute long documentary on the history of the Ende language within the Ende tribe. And this documentary, it's fully in Ende, it's on YouTube, it has English subtitles, and the video was produced for the current Ende children. And so it's a modern way of keeping up a very old tradition of passing knowledge from generation to generation. And they're using now, this was led by Tony Watamahir and Wagi Waggesser here. It's a new way of passing on this language. What's very interesting is that these efforts to document the local history, through them, we have learned a lot about patterns of migration, of people migration through New Guinea, which is something that we don't have a lot of written documentation of because most of these areas either don't have an active writing system or they were not colonized, so there isn't like survey work of the area. So through this documentation of traditional storylines, we've learned about patterns of migration and we've learned about patterns of language contact within the region. And these two very important historical accounts can help us unlock the genetic history of these language families to figure out how they're related to one another. We don't have evidence from 1900 or 1800 about what was being spoken here and what the languages sounded like. But these traditional stories do have knowledge that can help us unpack and figure out the linguistic history of the region. So, besides these new emphases on language variation and multilingualism and literary genres, I've also seen that fieldwork has become more inclusive. We see new technologies being developed for remote fieldwork, especially during the pandemic. And this has been able to make more communities involved that were not involved before because of the inability to access due to very remote places. Now, with these new technologies, that type of fieldwork has become more accessible. But we've also seen more researcher involvement. There's a lot of people who are unable to do linguistic fieldwork, either because they don't have the money to travel or the desire or the health or just the visas in order to do this type of work. But because now everything has been shifted to remote, we're seeing that there's more researchers that are being able to go into this area of research and more communities that are able to be involved. So that's what I'm going to leave you with today. I could have talked about so many other things, so I really appreciate the opportunity for you to invite me here to hear about my work. If you're interested in anything I've said or interested in more what linguistic fieldwork was like, what my next project is, I'm very happy to hear from you. Here's my email address, and I'll open it up for questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay. That was incredible, and that's just an amazing amount of work that you have done. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. As always, if you guys have questions, please feel free to raise your hands or write them in the chat. We have about 10 or 15 minutes. We have a little social hour planned after this, but we can cut into a little bit if you guys have a lot of questions. So feel free.
Thank you.